Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast. I'm Chris Muntz, and this is episode 74. Is the choral ecosystem a political monolith? With Reginal Wright. So I'm going to go ahead and start out by saying this is going to be a spoiler right at the beginning of the episode. The title will probably have, piqued your interest in some way when you're clicking on this episode. And I'm going to spoil it right away and say that I actually don't think the choral ecosystem is, in fact, a political monolith. It's just that we treat each other like it is. And so over the past year, I began to notice a breath of fresh air in the online choral discourse in the form of Reginal Wright. Like many of you, I have used Facebook to network with other choral directors that I don't know in real life. This has benefits for me as a podcast host, but can be a challenge on a personal level. Reginald, however, stood out to me because of his frequent posts inviting polite disagreement and creating a platform for multiple views to be expressed and treated with respect. So I had to speak with a kindred spirit on the show. In the course of this conversation, he and I talk about our approach to political discussions within professional spaces, in our classrooms, as well as the need to put our differences as choral directors aside in order to support each other, advocate for each other, and build each other up in a time when choral music has been assaulted over the last year and a half in terms of budgets, and the future of our profession is in a perilous state. We need each other. And so he and I will discuss this concept further over the course of the episode. We're really going to enjoy this. He's a lot of fun, so stick around and listen to that. Did you know that the Choralosophy podcast is entirely listener supported? So the way you support as a listener the show is by a win-win scenario, which is just the ideal situation. It's win-win, which means that if you get a discount, I get kickback. That's how it all works, right? So that's listener supported, meaning you choose to purchase those things like a Sight Reading Factory membership, like some choir folders next year for your choir at mymusicfolders.com. You choose to buy some sheet music at ryanmain.com or graphitepublishing.com. Every time you enter the promo code Choralosophy at checkout at any of those vendors, you get 10% off. There's also Voce Vista Video, which is that overtone analyzing software that I geek out about so much. It is a must. Get it in time for school year next year to start. It is fantastic. You go to vocevistavideo.com/choralosophy, and there you can download the software for free and play with it for 30 days. Once you decide you want to buy it, then you can enter in that Choralosophy promo code. So that's just a little behind the scenes on how it all works. I appreciate everyone's help, and without you listeners doing your part to make this show happen, it just wouldn't happen. So thanks for tuning in. Hope you enjoy the show. All right, everybody, I'm here with Reginal Wright, and Reginald and I are, of course, two colleagues and choral directors that are going to chat about a bunch of things today. But of course, I've never met Reginald before, so I'm excited to get to know him and hear a little bit about his perspective on a variety of things. So Reginald, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
All right. So before we dive into some more interesting and fun stuff, or some of the ideas that I want to discuss today eventually are around the idea of how we talk to each other as colleagues online. It's something that drew me to your account on Facebook because I noticed that you make a lot of posts about that topic as well, just kind of, which I do want to dig into. But there's always a good, in my opinion, when we're starting a conversation, it's good for people to understand the other person, where they come from. So could you tell me and my audience a little bit about who you are and where you come from and what got you to being a high school, correct? Choir teacher?
High school, yeah.
Okay. So what was your life journey to get you to where you are?
It was definitely a roller coaster. I grew up in East Texas, a town called Henderson, where I lived in a more less affluent part of the city. And so I was in like a gifted and talented program at my school. So during the course of a school week, let's say a school day, I would spend time, in the gifted and talented, section of the school. And then when I come home, I go back to sort of like an inner city. It's East Texas, so it wasn't really city. So inner country, I don't know what you call that. More of an urban type setting when I would go back home. So during my during my growing up, I kind of lived on, both sides of the street. So I had an incredibly cultured side, where we're doing things like host and band. And then I would come home, and we lived the urban side where, I would listen to rap, R&B, old 70s music, that the good stuff, Motown. So we kind of lived a full life. Once I finished high school, I went to college, of course, and I was a minor in music, and the focus was really on jazz piano. I took some choir in college. I mean, in high school. Loved it. That wasn't really something I wanted to go into, though. I was a trombone player in band, and so a little bit in band, But then I wanted to really learn the jazz piano thing. I have a relative of mine that was just an outstanding jazz pianist. I kind of wanted to follow in his steps. So
Uh-huh.
I went to college not as a choral major. I went as jazz piano minor. So
Interesting.
I finished. So once I finished college, I went back. Once I started teaching, I had to go back and get all of those classes to convert it over. So I was really a jazz pianist turned choir director from the hood. That's kind of that's
Yeah.
kind of my whole setup. When I started teaching, I started in Fort Worth at a middle school, fantastic middle school. We built it up. It was primarily like 8 general music classes. So we are learning, when I first started, all we were doing were, playing organ instruments and building recorders. We took that situation and turned it into a viable middle school choir program. From there, I went to high school in the same city, taught for 3 more years. And after those 3 years, I transitioned to Mansfield. It's a growing suburb of Arlington, and that's why I've been for the past.
Okay, so one of my observations about your story that you just told is uh, your your background was not like as a kid and as a young person was on these other musical aspects, some jazz, the piano, different types of things. So what I wonder is, was there a particular moment in a choir rehearsal or moment in a choir experience or with a director that kind of made a light bulb go off in your head that said, "Hey, I want to really switch focus to the choir now"? Like, was there one shining moment?
There was. We did and it was actually in high school. We did, and I don't know why we were doing, in retrospect, as a high school teacher, I don't know why we were doing this. Our director had us singing the Randall Thompson Hallelujah, which was just insane. And I just, that's what kind of kept me in choir.
Hmm.
We did that Hallelujah, and it was really cool. Just this complex piece. I don't think we did it well at all, but I love the way that Randall Thompson, the way he crafted that piece, and from there, that kind of kept me in choir. We sang Les Mis, and then we did the Phantom of the Opera in that same little spring show. I really liked that musical stuff, the way that they, put the chords and changes together from a musical Broadway perspective. So that drew my interest into it. And so after I got to Fort Worth, I just kind of wanted to do some teaching and not work in the business field anymore.
Hmm.
So from there, I went and started, teaching middle school, pretty easy music. But while I was they kind of put us together with the high schools, in festivals and all city situations where they would perform, the Moses Hogan / Eric Whitaker type works. And that's when my interest really shot up.
Huh.
And I just ingested just tons of choral music over that 8 years, and I got my my rep library really high, learned a ton of music, learned, musical styles, compositional styles. I was studying compositional styles too. And yeah, there went my whole transition.
That's interesting. I'm always fascinated with my guests to let them explain that to me, because I always feel like my journey into choral music is super boring, in that my mom was a choir director. I grew up with it. So like the idea of discovering choral music is foreign to me. I can't imagine. It's always been like, so it was part of my upbringing, to the point where it was like a natural extension of my life. So that's always interesting to hear other people's perspectives. Okay, so one of the things, like I mentioned, is that I noticed about you when I came across you on Facebook, is that every once in a while you will post something online where you're kind of calling out to colleagues to inviting some type of discussion or disagreement. Even sometimes you'll even invite a disagreement to be discussed on a post that you make, which is kind of, to me, that seems like something that should be normal, but it isn't. And so when I noticed that you do that, I kind of, my ears perked up a little bit, because regular listeners to my show know that that's actually the reason that I started this show 2 years ago. I started the show 2 years ago because I felt like nobody was talking to each other anymore. We were just posting our opinions on the internet, and then expecting them to just smile and nod, like everybody's just got to smile and nod. And so what I'm wondering is to get your perspective on what you see and what you notice, and what inspired you to make those types of posts.
Okay, so as I was telling you, in my background from being a kid, I grew up in both environments, right? I grew up in an incredibly, I would say, not poor per se, but not just incredibly, not with a whole lot of money either.
Right.
But I went to school with students that were affluent, and their parents did well. I got to hang out with them, and go to their homes and do all of that. So I got an opportunity to kind of see and be around people that think differently. And so with that, once you kind of get a chance to see on the inside of both situations, living in one side, living in one situation and knowing it, but spending enough time with other students my age and in my classes, I had an opportunity to see things that that you probably wouldn't see if you weren't from that demographic. And what that allowed me to see and understand is that there are reasons why people feel certain ways about certain things. And we never take the opportunity to dive into the reasoning behind a certain belief. We just attack the belief. And so that's where I love dialogue and just asking questions. It's like, hey, I want to see and hear, where that's coming from and why that affects you so deeply to make you feel that way. And I'd love to learn from you. I'm always willing to learn. And a lot of times when I've done that, most people, I guess, I don't know for what reason, they won't respond directly to the post, but they'll send an inbox message, to have the conversation. I guess they don't want to see, us working it out. And so, but most of the time we get it worked out. I just think if we have an opportunity to see, where the reasoning behind this thinking, then we could work better toward a solution,
Mm-hmm.
or at least a compromise.
Right. Because I always feel like it doesn't have to result in an agreement.
Right.
It could simply result in both parties still disagreeing by the end of the conversation, but at the very least, they could have learned why the other person actually holds that belief.
Yes.
Rather than just me guessing and then projecting that onto you.
Right.
I could walk away at least saying, okay, I see where you're coming from on that. And so what I'm wondering, do you have any kind of examples of conversations that you've struck up online that were, that I guess were pet peeves of yours or passion points of yours to learn more about? Or do you have any stories to tell us about that? One interesting thing about the Choralosophy podcast is that it is completely independently produced, meaning there is no organization, no institution, no foundation behind this show or behind this production. There's no company, nothing. It's all supported by listeners and listener involvement. The most direct way that you can do that is through Patreon. At patreon.com/Choralosophy, you can join a subscribers only environment where I put extra content, meaning a behind the scenes episode every month, supplemental materials. The people on the Patreon get to see who's coming on the show ahead of time, which means they can put bugs in my ear ahead of time about what I should ask the person about. All kinds of fun perks. There's even an awesome Choralosophy hat and t-shirt. There's all kinds of fun ways to do that over at Patreon. Now, it's an important thing because if you enjoy this show, a couple thousand or so people that tune in on a regular basis to this show, if 10% of you were to join the Patreon, it would change the game for my ability to make this production better and better over the course of the next year. So producers, there is a producer level that you can opt into over there as well. The Patreon producers are Ulrika Igrain Munoz Alarcon, Chandler Smith, David Kowalczyk, Kyle Peterson, Michael Herron, Ryan Main, and Steve and Kathy Kakachik.
The biggest ones, I didn't really start, throwing it out there until I try not to be too political on my posts. And sometimes I'll post one and my wife will say, yeah, that's too political. You need to take it down. And then it'll go away. So she's really good like that. But I started posting them at the height of the police shootings, because they were really, really, bad. And I'm posting them almost from a dual perspective. A lot of the men in my family back in East Texas were police officers. They were also servicemen too. My granddad served in Vietnam. I had an uncle that served over there as well, cousins. So that perspective of what being an American is, and all these these things, that's kind of a big deal in my family. But at the same time, I was a Black man and I was watching these injustices happen. And so in my perspective, and guys in my Black males in my and I'm just going to say in my family,
right,
we were caught in a weird conundrum, when we were saying, when Kaepernick started the whole kneel thing, his reasoning behind it, I'm like, okay, that makes sense. My uncle or my granddad, they fought. So it's weird. And so after listening to his perspective and hearing that it was actually a serviceman that told him to kneel, and do it peacefully, that made sense. So that was a discussion that I welcomed. And I was just always a little puzzled as to why there was a compromise for me, since him doing it the way he did it was peaceful and quiet. It didn't really bother anyone, but certain individuals wouldn't let go of the fact that he just wasn't standing and doing the pledge traditionally.
right.
But he was doing it, in a way that he felt sent a message. That reminds me too, I was listening this morning. They were talking about gentlemen that I don't know their names. When they Olympics and they did the fist instead of the
yeah, I know what you're talking about.
That same type of thing, non-violent, but man, it sent a message. So I guess for me, it's one of those things where, hey, can you just try to see life through the eyes of someone that's disenfranchised or that's not getting justice before you just go so hard on the action.
Hmm. Yeah, it's actually interesting because I just had a guest on last week, Dr. Eric Smith, who's a professor of rhetoric, and that's basically the art and science of how we use words to communicate. And he brought up the Colin Kaepernick example specifically. I didn't even ask him about that, but he brought it up as an example. So it's interesting that you bring up that example because it does kind of illustrate one of those broken discourses that we have where these things are so hard to discuss. And his example was that um, when Colin Kaepernick sees the American flag, he sees he chooses to focus on some of those injustices. Whereas when some people that might have disagreed with Colin Kaepernick's display, they might look at the American flag and they might focus on the things they like about it, like freedom and liberty and justice. And then what Dr. Smith's point is that the American flag as a symbol represents all those things. Those are all
Yes,
true.
totally.
And so what's interesting about the discourse is that one group of people might choose to focus on the good things about it. Another group of people might choose to focus on the bad things about it. But what we lose in the conversation is we lose that we all see those things and there is common ground. And I think that's one of the things that is so hard about online conversation is it's hard to start with the common ground. And that's
Totally.
a good example of that.
Yeah, because when we're dug in, we go in. I think a lot of times we go into the conversation like I'll have this conversation with you, but I'm not going to change. I'm going to
Mhm.
I'm going to hold serve. And I think where I got to the point to really start looking for a common ground was that my the culmination of my life fit around both those things. So we had family members that were servicemen, but we're also, African American people that, we're watching this reel happen over and over and over again. And we can name all the names, but so I'm seeing it both. I'm seeing it both ways, and I'm trying to reach out to people from both sides to, hey, okay, yes, we are definitely, uh, you know, possibly being targeted. We're not getting justice, but it could be worse. And, I'm looking at it. I'm looking at it both ways. Or, hey, yes, we are free, but there are some people, economically or systemically that are still in pretty bad shape. So I'm trying to bridge this gap so that we can all see how we could all kind of work together to make this situation better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I believe that as choir directors, we also have a responsibility to do that for because of the nature of our job. And I think this is a hard nut for me to crack with a lot of my colleagues, in that I'm assuming teaching choir in Texas, where you are, you have a pretty diverse group of political opinions in your choir.
In Texas,
Uh huh.
oh yes.
Right. And so my thought is, we teach kids. I might have kids in front of me who have Republican parents, that some that have Democrat parents, some that have completely not politically active parents at all. And a lot of what their opinions are at that age are going to be shaped a lot by their parents. They're not adults yet. And so I
Right.
believe my responsibility is to create an environment that's inclusive of all of them.
Yes.
Absolutely all of them, even if their parents might hold a view that I find abhorrent. Maybe they've even adopted that view themselves as students, but then I have to remember that I believed a whole bunch of stupid stuff when I was 16.
Totally.
And so I do see my role as a choir director as one that's it's not my job to decide who's right or wrong. It's to help foster an environment where everybody's perspective can be heard. Every singer then can feel like they're part of the group equally. Is that something that you think about too with this topic?
Yes, it is. And as a matter of fact, during the January 6th, and actually this was man, we spent like 3 days talking about, all of the activity that happened at the Capitol on January the 6th. And what I did is I want to foster an empathetic environment to where we can kind of understand, where each other, where these thoughts and these beliefs come from. And listening to the students talk, it was incredible how broad that spectrum was that we went into. But after just the way that I run the dialogue, the way that I am as a person, they came to a place to where we could really work through it. And I think the students were better at this than what I saw online.
Oh, for
Honestly.
sure.
Yeah, the students came together and they figured it out, um, and proposed ways that were logical. I mean, 16 and 17, the best they can do is write a congressman, you know,
Hmm.
and I was I am so impressed with the youth of today, with the way that they can, come together. Maybe not necessarily agree all the way, but hey, I can see your point. That was impressive to me, that the young people did that. Whereas I turned my computer on the same day, and oh man, it was rough.
Hmm. Yeah. Now, how do you feel about the idea that as music teachers and that we have a job or we have a role uh, to teach a political perspective in the choir rehearsal? Because that is something that we're told by some folks, some colleagues. Do you ever come across that, and how do you feel about that idea?
I don't, and I think my status. I think because I'm kind of like a independent politically,
Hmm.
so I'm kind of I'm in between. So I get a chance, so I can kind of go both ways with it, because these thoughts and beliefs, they kind of affect different people differently. And I guess I'm just more of a humanist. I'm like, as a human, these things are right, these things are wrong. Your party just has to. This party is doing this wrong, or this party is doing this. So I don't particularly side with one over the other. I just happen to I just happen to live where the school that I'm in is incredibly red, but there's a lot of every other thing in there too. A
Hmm.
lot of Democrats, a lot of Republicans, a lot of independents too. It's a large independent place. So politically, I don't really go into it. Um, if I have to have a discussion, my discussion's more about how this affects human beings.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think uh, I'm skeptical of the idea in the first place that as a choir director we are called to be activists in the rehearsal. And I think and my skepticism of that really comes down to what I said earlier, which is that I know that I'm going to have students in my classroom who have been taught by their parents. Let's say I'm an activist for whatever topic.
Hmm.
You could choose any kind of topic. I'm going to have some percentage of my classroom that might have been taught the opposite thing by their parents. In which case, I then feel like I'd be in a position if I was really advocating for a political idea in my class, that I would be essentially putting that student in a position where they've got to pick between their parent and me,
Yes.
and I'm not comfortable with that.
No, neither am I.
Yeah.
I'm not.
Yeah, and I think sometimes though the part of this is a symptom of this online conversation that we're kind of discussing and dancing around a little bit, which is that when conversations happen online, we are kind of incentivized to draw a line in the sand, and make a statement that's really simple and really direct, and it doesn't make a lot of room for these conversations that you and I are talking about right now. It doesn't leave any space for them because, well, for example, like Twitter, there's a character limitation. You can't make very complex arguments. And on Facebook, the way the algorithm works, this is part of my last episode too, where if let's say I'm talking with somebody who disagrees with me about something, the algorithm knows to send out notifications to all that person's friends, and they're going to see that their friend is in this conversation. So they're going to come running to save the day. And then it ends up being this big fight when,
Yes.
when in reality, if it were an in-person conversation, it just probably wouldn't be a fight.
Right. And the, I love that you brought up the algorithm situation.
Mm-hmm.
And because what that has done, it's almost divided us and just put us in a place to where we only fellowship with people that think exactly the same way we do.
Mm-hmm.
And I just always thought that that was just a boring world if we all thought the same, if we all thought the same way. So I don't know if you saw this around election time. I wanted to change my algorithm, and so about a month before that, my dog died, and I was just really sad. And we were thinking about getting another dog, and so we were talking about dogs, in the house, and then these dogs show up on my feed. And I'm like, okay, so there may be something to this. And so at that point, I went in and I made several requests. Hey, send me pictures of dogs. Send me dogs, all shapes and sizes. And we just flooded my timeline with dogs. And then at that point, all the commercials for dog boarders, dog groomers, dog breeders, they all came up, and I purposefully went in and I mean, like, seriously interacted with all of them. And so from Halloween to Christmas, I had almost changed my entire environment. And in the house, we had to keep the devices, off so that it wouldn't hear us.
Mm-hmm.
And I turned it into dogs because I didn't want to hear dialogue, and it worked. And then of course, I jumped in some other things, and it just kind of exploded. And now I'm back where I started.
That is, yeah, it's really powerful. And I think people underestimate the power of the algorithms and how they shape our perception of the world and of each other. I've come across quite a few people that when I try to explain it to them, they think that I'm speaking in conspiracy theory type language. In other words, that it feels to me like there are some people who actually think that when they open their phone to look at Facebook or when they're looking at Twitter or whatever, that they are actually seeing a realistic picture of what the world is. And
Yeah.
that's what worries me, is that people don't know they're being manipulated. And what's I think the frustration I feel is that one of the things we are being manipulated to do is to be mad at each other. Like
Yes.
they're doing it on purpose because for example, did you ever see the documentary the Social Dilemma on
Oh,
Netflix?
it's one of the best movies I've ever. That was one of the best docs I've ever seen.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things you learn there is that some of these social media companies actually hired consultants who are psychologists to come in and tell them what will make people click more. And they learned that it's being really mad. Like if they're really mad or scared, they're going to stay on there all day and keep clicking and keep engaging in the content. And so they actually set out to figure out ways to get us to fight more, and we're just giving them exactly what they want.
Yes, totally. And I noticed that I noticed that in some of the, like, I'm a choir director, like,
Oh
and
man.
yeah, some of that, like some of that, I'm like, yeah, I'm not touching that one. I just kind of leave it alone because it some of that stuff got, I mean, just really ugly. And I'm listening to colleagues talk to each other that way. And this is the way I look at it. Um, I always thought that we as choir directors, because I was looking at, I watched the rebroadcast that you all put up about the elitism. Uh, I watched that a week or so ago when you played that.
Mm-hmm.
I watched that one, and it made sense, but it was also sad.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because here's the real situation. We should be each other's advocates as best we can for our craft and for our schools. Because in 2008, 2009, when the economic bubble went bad, the first program we were discussing cutting were our programs.
Yep. Oh,
So
yeah.
if your program is getting cut, it doesn't really matter what you're singing about. And so
Yes.
when you're operating at the bottom, if you're at the bottom of Maslow's pyramid, you don't really care how good your group looks on Facebook when you post it. You know, so I think we've all gotten comfortable, with knowing that we're going to have a job or knowing that there's going to be funding, and we're kind of at the tip, of that self-actualization point that we think that our opinion matters. But in essence, if they had something that needed to be cut, man, we're at the front of that line. So I think we should do better at advocating and promoting each other, instead of fighting over, I think, sometimes trivial topics. Some of the things need to be discussed, and some of it's right, but some of it doesn't matter.
Right. And even the important things. So even the things that do need to be discussed, I would argue they still don't need to be fought about. In other words, we're choir directors. We're not like cutting out cancerous tumors in people. Like our job is important, but I don't think any of it raises to a level of insults and fighting with each other, because here's the thing. Even if you're passionate enough about a topic that you think on, let's say on I'm a choir director, and you want to jump in and be involved in that conversation, if we don't follow certain types of collegial norms, meaning here's how I'm not going to talk to a colleague just because it's not professional, then what we risk is, let's say there's that really important conversation that you believe in. If we talk to the person a certain way, we're just going to push them out of the conversation. At
Totally.
which point, if you're truly passionate about that topic, you've just shot yourself in the foot.
Yeah, and that's what happens in a lot of these relationships. I think, we dig in so much, and then when the name calling and the disrespect starts, the point of compromise is gone at that point.
Right. Right.
And some of these that I log in and catch, I don't have the words. I'm speechless. I'm like, yeah, that one's, yeah, I'm not even jumping in on that.
Right. Yeah. Earlier you mentioned with the algorithms of the problem of kind of echo chambers that get created on social media, where we only then interact with other people who already agree with us. And that is a huge problem. That's that's a societal problem, I guess you could say, not just a choir
Right.
problem. But would you say that you've noticed that choir people might even be a little bit worse than normal on this topic?
I think they are. And it's all this stuff that's kind of built in. And then I think that elitism thing is kind of an issue too. It's almost like if I'm in a prosperous or great situation and your situation doesn't affect me, then it just doesn't affect me. You're on your own, bro. Whereas I honestly think that what affects one of us affects all of us in some way. If you pull out on a macro level, and I think like being a suburban teacher like I am now, but coming from a more urban setting, I can see, like, I totally get both sides. I understand the struggles. I understand budgetary and monetary situations, and I, I'm willing and open to have those conversations with anybody, especially administrators, just because it could how it would affect all of us. I just think we could be better advocates for each other, and especially if we have a platform where we could do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I asked that question because I think yes, the echo chambers happen, and they happen on social media. We've already discussed, and it seems like you agreed with me that they're kind of doing it to us on purpose, and I believe that very strongly. But with choir people, I think one thing we have to remember, and maybe be put our big kid pants on enough to admit it, is that in choir world we are artists, which are primarily already on the left.
Yes.
We are educators, which are also primarily on the left, and then you add those prior biases into the mix, and then get on social media, which is going to continue to push you further into your echo chambers. And I think that what that has done is made there have been interesting things that I've observed over the last couple of years of doing this show that make it very clear to me that the choir part of my Facebook feed is in a different world than all the quote unquote normal people that I know.
Yeah,
Um,
it's pretty far out there.
yeah, yeah, and I wonder. I actually did a poll in my Facebook group once, and just because I was curious, I didn't do an episode about it or anything. I was just curious, where I was asking, what percentage of your friends, asking choir people, what percentage of your friends are not choir people? Just because I wanted to see kind of a representative sample of, do most choir people spend most of their time with other choir people? And the answers were mixed, of course, but I would say the majority said that a majority of their friends are choir/music people. And so what I'm concerned about with that is, not only are we in our echo chambers online, a good portion of us are in echo chambers outside of the internet as well. And it might cause like this unique ecosystem of not really understanding some of the lives of our students.
Totally. And I think that's one of the things. I think that's one of the things that my history gives me the advantage on, because I've been in so many different circles,
Hmm.
that all these connections that I made are a lot of connections are not even in education. So it's wonderful to hear, the perspectives of people that are not even in academia, just regular people living their lives. Like, hey, what do you think about this? And just hearing what they say. And I know there are a few things that, we as choir teachers were kind of, I can't think of one specifically, but I would ask someone else and they would tell me, and I'm like, whoa, yeah, yeah, okay, I can see that, where we as choir, teachers are, yeah, you're right, in a completely different world.
Hmm. Yeah, and this has been something my whole career that I've been observing, partly because, like you, it sounds like I'm not on either side. In fact, I would even use stronger language, in that I usually tell people I'm against both sides. Um,
Yes.
and that I see a lot of harm in just the fact that we have a two-party system in the first place. I think that's where a lot of the harm comes from. It's what causes people to feel like they have to grasp 100% of the right answer. Because if you're thinking about two parties, winner take all, and
Somebody has to lose.
somebody's got to lose, and so that's part of the two-party thing. But of course, that's its own separate podcast. So, since I don't fit into that category of being one of the typical, demographically one of the typical choir directors, which is somebody who's on the left politically and aligns myself politically with the party, the Democratic Party in the US, or if I have a lot of listeners around the world, and whatever the left party is in your country. I think that puts me in a weird position when to then come on, and now I've been doing this show for 2 years, and it causes people to not know what box to put me in, which is very confusing for people, and it makes them uncomfortable.
Yes.
And that's really, I think that should show people that we have a problem. Like, we have a problem. If you need to put someone in a box, there's already a problem.
Yeah. And a lot of times, um, just because of the way I was brought up, I automatically, and my influences growing up, I was left. You know, I wasn't like crazy far left, but left ideology. But after I, went to college and hanging out with people, and some of the people that I spent time with as I was growing up, I saw the ideals of the right too. and so I can see the things that are beneficial and detrimental on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just weird because everyone wants you to, hey, you need to choose a team, jump on one and jump on the other. I'm like, I'm just gonna kind of roll solo on this,
Mm-hmm.
and see what happens, because um they have these deal breakers and on both sides. And I don't particularly agree with any of your deal breakers. So that disqualifies me from being in your party. So that, like, hey, you can't be this because you have to believe this. I'm like, well, yeah, I kind of don't believe that though. So I'm just kind of this nomad. And you're right, some of the conversations get really, really uncomfortable, because at some point, the way the independent has to bring up the fallacy of the party that the individual that I'm speaking to
Mm-hmm.
has. I have to tell you about that.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I've my experience has been that it's not uncommon for me to, on the same day, be called some kind of left wing commie person or some kind of right wing Trump supporter type person on the same day by different people, because depending on your perspective, what people notice is just, hey, you're not on my team. And
Yes.
since you're not on my team, you must be on the other team. And that's really as deeply as some people think about it,
It's
which
that
is unfortunate.
that old, if you've seen that old episode 3 Star Wars, when Anakin and Obi-Wan, he's like, if you're not for me, you're against me. I'm
Uh-huh.
like, yeah, it's that type of Sith thinking.
Right. Right. Now, my theory on choir world politically is that we are actually, it online, it looks like we're a monolith, because there is really only one way of describing a lot of things politically in choir world that is acceptable, that won't get you crucified online. But I don't
Yes.
think we actually are a monolith. I think what's happened, and this is what some of my concern with this topic it comes from, is that I think that people who don't agree with the dominant narratives online in choir world just don't go online to talk about stuff anymore. And I've had that message come into my show privately, like you mentioned. People will private message, but they won't engage in those conversations on public posts because of this. So I think what we're creating for ourselves, unfortunately, is the myth that everybody agrees on lots of different things in the choir world, and when we don't
Yes.
actually, what we're actually doing is bullying people out of the conversations.
Right. And like I was saying, some of those conversations, when I would see it, I'm I'm like, whoa, I'm not touching that,
Mhm.
and I'm out of there. That,
Yeah.
snooze 30 days, we'll check back in a month, and we're done.
Right. Right. I think some good examples, at least that I can think of off the top of my head, would be things like what is and what isn't cultural appropriation. That would be an example of a conversation where a good portion of number of colleagues would have very strong opinions on that, but just wouldn't enter the conversation. Because their opinion might not be the one that the I'm a choir director Facebook page would like to endorse, and so they just stay out of the conversation. But then I would put that topic in a category of something that is important that we should be talking about.
That is one of the most important topics that should be discussed. And there's some in that particular group, there's some really good topics on it.
Hmm.
Um, Another one, which I don't even know how I fit in this one, was the one could it's a little weird, because I just finished performing this Wade in the Water by Alan Kepke, and I mean, it turned out well. I loved the song. I loved what he did with it. And so that conversation of, can white guys write spirituals? And I'm like, if he's writing it, if he's writing it right, then I say, yeah.
Hmm. Yep.
And I loved that spiritual. It had some of the things that traditionalists like Moses Hogan wouldn't subscribe to, like, stomping and whatever, some of that stuff. And I understand that, but my students connected with the song. We went through the history. We talked about the whole song, the text, and where it came from, and it turned out great. And so, but that's a pretty edgy topic
Right.
too. Can white guys write spirituals? You
Well,
know,
because what people do is they want the simple answer.
yeah,
And so if you want the simple answer and you want it to align with social justice activism, you just say no. No,
right.
white people can't do that. And the problem is it's more complicated than that. So here's one of the ways that I would think about it. I had Brandon Boyd on the show back
Totally.
in the
Yes.
first year, back when because he's a good friend of mine, and so back when I didn't have much of an audience and I needed some good guests, he did me a favor and came on the show, and we talked about this. We in fact did a whole episode on it, and one of the things, and I think he had just at that time flown back from Belize, spending like a couple weeks studying the music of some composers from Belize, and no, that's not his music, yet he wanted to be able to study it and understand it. And I think that principle, if we're really going to make progress, that has to apply across the board, meaning that we want to have music be universal at some point. That's a goal. But then at the same time, we need to acknowledge that there is a time. I'm old enough to remember a time when white composers and arrangers were taking spirituals and just churning out crap that is completely inauthentic. And back in the 80s and 90s, that crap would make them a ton of money.
Yes.
And because then all the white directors out there can buy the spiritual, and there was no education, there was no
No.
digging into the history. So that's a legitimate criticism. And so the reason I bring that up as an example is it's more complicated than just yes or no.
Right.
It's yes in this circumstance, but maybe no in this other circumstance. And that's why we need to have the conversation.
Totally. Yeah. And if it's and I think I want to say I want to say it was uh, Brandon and maybe Brandon Waddles. They had this same conversation. It if we're covering the nuances and the actual history that's in the spiritual, then yeah, I think. But at the same time, it's like I think black people could write motets.
Yes. Yes.
So it's like it's that same thing. And since I'm working on doing composing now, I'm writing quite a bit, and most of the things I'm writing are not spirituals. But at the same time, most of the music that we hear that's not spirituals are not written by black composers either. Other than
Mhm.
you got your Victor Johnsons, your Persephone, they're already out there, but you don't hear a lot of other. Let me see, Marcus Garrett, maybe Dr. Thomas, but past those you don't hear a whole lot. And so I'm trying to write in this different style that's not a spiritual, and it's being received well. But at the same time, I'm thinking that door is open where I can walk through both sides. I think that avenue should be available too for individuals that wanted to take a shot at the spiritual.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, um, I think I brought up this example to Brandon and when I talked to him, but in my master's degree, my focus of my research and my scholarship for my thesis was the music of the Italian and French Baroque. Okay. I am not Italian or French. I just really, really liked that music. And
Yes.
I wanted to do it justice and honor by studying it and learning what is in a lot of ways uh, what I saw as an under-researched area, which is why I did a thesis in it. I wanted to research something about that music that I didn't feel like there was a lot on. Um, and so one of the things that I think is true about the music of Black cultures, plural, around the world,
Sure.
is that we haven't studied them as much, and we need to start, right? So to me, the greatest compliment, the greatest sign of progress would be that we're opening doors, like you said, to more and more people studying and applying scholarship to those types of music. And one of the things that I struggle to get people to understand is we live in a 70% white country.
Yes.
So if that music is going to be treated as equal, then some white people are going to have to study it too.
Right.
And so we shouldn't be pushing people away with this rhetoric that we use online about gatekeeping and setting boundaries. And we should be saying, we should educate people about how to study this, how to approach it, and then inviting them in.
Yes.
Like that's my beef.
And thanks to Dr. Thomas, Anton Armstrong, Brandon Boyd, that there are resources to learn how to do this correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so the people that I would consider gatekeepers are now saying, hey, you're welcome. Here's how to do it. Come and learn how to do it. And hey, write as much as you like.
Right.
And that's really been incredible. And that's in my opinion, that was one of the shining gifts of quarantine is, these people with all of this knowledge, they were doing Zoom sessions for free that you could go in and just learn about pretty much anything that you wanted to from all over the world without ever leaving, your home or even putting on shoes.
Mm-hmm.
You could learn whatever you wanted to know about anything, whether it be musical or just cooking. You could find it out from the best in the field.
Right.
And I think that choral music really offered some really great nuggets during that time.
Absolutely. And those scholars that you mentioned, I wouldn't even call them the gatekeepers. I would call them they're the gate openers.
The gate openers. Yeah, yes, I would say that. Yes.
And the gatekeepers, as I see them, are usually and this is going to be so snarky, but I just can't handle it. Are white choir directors that nobody's ever heard of in Facebook groups. They're the ones telling that they like to be seen as allies. So they come in and then they drop that oversimplified. There's a race scholar that I'm friends with on Twitter that likes to use the term oprification of social justice, where they want that little blurb that makes them look like a hero, where they get to come in and say, no, that music's not for you. That music's not for you.
I can see that.
Yeah. And then there's the Brandon Boyd types who say, no, it's music. Like we need to treat it the same way we treat Bach, the same way that we treat Mozart, which is that we want as many people to sing it as possible. We want to open the doors to this music.
Yeah. Now that you say that like that, yeah, there's a lot of those.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
There's a whole lot of those.
Yeah. Sometimes I use the other term. So oprification of social justice. I also use the term memification of social justice, which is, again, that when I make those criticisms, that's who I'm talking about. I'm talking about the people who don't get it. I'm not, and oftentimes I actually think that they are doing it well in a well-intended way. In other words, when they try to look like an ally, they think they're doing good. And that's why it's so tricky, because it's really hard to tell someone who thinks they're doing good that, hey, I don't think you're doing good.
Yeah, it's because if when we're having to dig in and pick sides, that I don't see that as being productive in a lot of cases. Right.
Yeah, because then you get all the kind of the silent majority, I would call them, in the choir world, who are just really on those Facebook groups. They really just want to read and learn, but because they see all that fighting going on, they stay out of the conversation. And my belief, I believe so strongly in conversation. Heck, I started a podcast because I believe so strongly in conversation, is that if you stay out of the conversation, you are going to learn less. You've got to participate in the conversation to learn. And since we've created this environment, I would call it a huge problem that so many people just don't engage in the conversation at all because they're afraid to get canceled or lambasted or attacked or whatever it is.
I agree. And I've seen some people get canceled. Well, we've seen some people get canceled, over the last year.
Yep.
And some deserved, some we could have heard them out a little bit.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And my rule on that is, that's actually kind of plays into the social media algorithms though too, is that there's this concept called the anchoring bias, which is that if someone takes a snippet of what someone says and then puts it in a new context, and then the first time you see that is with that new context in your mind, then it's really hard to ever learn that maybe that was wrong. Um, so for example, if let's say somebody, um, takes a quote out of context and then puts it in a context of, hey, this was racist. Well, okay, but maybe the person wasn't even talking about race related things at all when they made that comment. But once it's been put in that context, it's really hard for people to shake that. That's happened to me. I mean, it's absolutely happened to me. Um, and so it's one of those things where I think we have to be careful. And my rule is, if you're concerned with the way somebody said something online, ask them a question.
You
At least ask them one. What did you mean by this? And having the courage to say, "Hey, this rubbed me the wrong way. Could you explain to me where you're coming from on this?" Because that's how colleagues would treat each other.
and I think that's kind of where, like, whenever I would put a post up, which I haven't done it in a while because I've been so busy, it's in that, like, hey, I saw what okay, here's one right now that's happening. Um and it's kind of, it's in the Black community, but nevertheless it's still a discussion. And I'm getting caught up on it now. There is there's a popular Black comedian that made a comment about Black females wearing bonnets and pajamas at the airport.
Okay.
and so and so what she was saying, because she's from an older generation that says, hey, when you go out in public, your hair is done, your makeup is right, you dress a certain way, we're not wearing pajamas out in public. And man, the like the lashback that she got from that was so bad. And me, I was raised by my grandmother, so I totally agreed with her. I'm like, hey, okay, yeah, I think that's right. And but just watching where that conversation went, it was incredible. And people are locked in, and no one's trying to know what I'm like. We're talking about makeup and bonnets, but it's a big topic to some people.
Yeah.
And so I think I'm going to make one that welcomes the discussion, of this whole thing. And I think it's kind of, some people are where, it's my body, I do what I want. And the older people are like, yeah, but you should present, yourself in a certain light, whatever. I'm still getting the information on it though, so I can be educated enough when I'm when I make this discussion.
That's hilarious. Yeah, it's interesting, those generational differences too, regardless of
Yes.
skin color. They're generational cultural things that are, the world's changing so fast right now that, yeah, I've come across some of those same things, in my own circles. So, okay, so on the way out, this has been just a fantastic conversation. I'm really enjoying it. I could do it all day, but I would like to make sure that you get a chance to, because I know you're composing, you're arranging. Tell us about what you're doing there, where we can find your music, and maybe any kind of exciting projects or compositions that you have coming out soon.
Okay, cool. So we haven't made this announcement yet, but I am going to make it now, and maybe it'll be out before before we get this aired. Um, Graphite Music is one of the sponsors of this show, which is fantastic. And just over the last year, I've done several pieces that's been accepted into the Graphite catalog.
Awesome.
So we have 4 pieces coming out with Jocelyn and Tim. We're editing them now and getting them ready to go. I've put up a little bit, just snippets of the pieces, as they're more of a grade 4, grade 5, so they're a little more a little more difficult. But I still have my educational songs, and you can find my catalog on reginalwright.com. REGINALWRIGHT. There's no D on my name. sorry, .com, and everything is there. I've been doing a whole lot of commissions lately. So I have 7 commissions coming up this year. So we're excited about that. We're getting that music out. If you like to do one, you can catch me on the website. I'd love to partner with anybody. Mostly I'm writing for school groups. It's pretty much all school groups, and we just kind of, as a school choir director, I really understand, what directors are needing in their choirs, regarding voicing, regarding personnel, regarding, the structure of the male voice or the male changing voice or the problems with recruiting males, just whatever. I've seen it all in my time teaching. So I know how to, write toward those issues. So it's really exciting, good stuff coming out. And I hope that, you'll purchase it or even invite me to write.
Yeah. Ooh, that's exciting. So I'll make sure that as I'm editing it, this episode, that I'll hook up with you and get links to everything that you would want. That way, sure. when somebody clicks on this episode, they're going to have access to all that.
Absolutely.
Okay. Awesome. Well, Reginald, this was lots of fun. I appreciate you butting heads with me and putting our ideas together about this topic, because I think it's important.
Oh, I love it. I had a blast, and hopefully we can do it again soon. These topics are going to keep coming up.
Oh yeah.
So the discussion will just keep revitalizing itself.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you, my friend. I appreciate it.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of the episode. I appreciate all of you long-haul listeners who stick around and engage yourself in long-form conversation, even if you turn it up to 1.5 speed, which is what I've started doing with all the podcasts I listen to, because I can do a 1-hour podcast in 40 minutes. And that just means I can consume more conversation, more thought, more nuance of what people's views actually are on a topic. And I just think that the world so badly needs more conversation. In fact, in the show notes, you are going to find a link to a thread I did on becoming a radical discourse activist. And I will probably have a few more comments on that on the show in the future, because it's this idea that I've been kind of working on, the idea of mathematically proving how complex the world is and why we need to talk to each other about our experiences of it. So again, thank you so much for sticking around. And what I hope you will do is help out in any way that you can, whether it be financially by going to patreon.com/Choralosophy and signing up for the $3, the $5, or the $10 level there. You could also use the promo code at any of the sponsors that you've heard about on the show. Voce Vista, RyanMain.com, GraphitePublishing.com, Sight Reading Factory, My Music Folders. All of those websites are fantastic and have great products that help you do your job really well. And you can get a discount when you enter Choralosophy at checkout. Then, of course, there is the non-financial ways, which is just helping to spread the word, whether it be engaging someone in a conversation on one of my posts, engaging me in conversation on the Choralosophers Facebook page, or sending an email to choralosophy@gmail.com. Thanks a lot, everyone, for listening. Hope you're having a good summer. See you next time.